Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we're going through the famous book by Richard Reti, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. Now we had just looked at a brief introduction to the Reti opening, and now we're going to see one of the games played by Richard Reti himself within this opening, where in this opening Black will push an early d4. Now, white is Richard Reti, and black is the famous Akiba Rubinstein. Reti starts off with knight f3, d5, and this is what we discussed before. In the previous video we looked at the immediate c4. However, things can transpose. So Reti starts with an early g6, bishop g2, and here Rubinstein plays g6 himself, and c4. So it's quite similar to the previous game, except we have this g6 move. Except now Rubinstein plays d4. And Reti says that he thinks this pawn advance is a bit dubious. He prefers c6 defending the pawn. Reti continues with d3, and we have bishop to g7. So Reti's plan is to try and isolate this pawn and win it, or potentially push e3 to trade it off, because then white will be the one with the superior centre. Now it's worth noting, if black tries to defend this pawn, this doesn't really work out too well. b4 is a potential option, because after, say, c takes b4, you can always win the pawn back if you want to. And if you try and defend it, then knight f to d2, knight f to d2 will just win the rook on a8. So we see bishop g7 instead. And now we see Reti continue with b4. So Reti's making it so black can never safely play c5, effectively isolating this pawn permanently, intending to later on push e3 and trade it off, or to just outright capture the pawn. So we have castles, knight b to d2, and now c5. Now Reti comments that here black doesn't really have any good defences to stop white's plan of trying to either win this pawn or trade it off with e3. So Rubinstein plays c5 instead, essentially going for the least worst option, trying to take the sting out of white's plan. Now white continues with knight to b3, and black still can't defend this pawn, because with b6 we would have this attack on the rook, and the rook would be lost. So therefore black decides to try and give up this d pawn for this b pawn. So he takes some b4. And he's hoping to try and defend this pawn later on, and essentially give up this pawn. Now here Reti plays bishop b2, attacking the pawn. He doesn't go in for the immediate knight b takes d4, because e5 can come, and black's able to get more of the centre control and a bit of initiative here. So instead he plays bishop b2, delaying the capture by one move. We have knight to c6, and now knight takes d4. Because after knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, e4 just loses the pawn. Now we have b6. Obviously if the knight moves, then the rook has this free square. So now we have b6, and we have a3. So with this a3 move, Reti comments that he's trying to open up files to white's advantage. He wants this a and b file to play along. He says that if you played something like knight to d2, trying to perhaps win the exchange, this doesn't quite work because of queen takes d4. Because after bishop takes a8, knight to g4 will come, threatening mate, and after you castle, knight takes f2 is still a potential option, because rook takes f2, queen takes a1 because of this battery, queen takes, bishop takes, and now black has the advantage. Black is simply up a pawn, and these queenside pawns are going to very quickly become pass pawn, and moves like bishop d4 are threatened as well, and black also has the bishop pair in a relatively open position. So this now is black's, this is just a one game for black. So we have a3 instead of knight to d2, and then bishop to b7, and now bishop to b2. The immediate capture here doesn't work due to bishop takes f3 first, essentially removing the guard, because we'll have the exact same tactic as before, where we'll end up in a very similar position as before. So we have bishop b2, removing the queen takes d4 ideas. And now black is going to lose this pawn if they don't take it. So black takes. It's almost forced. They're going to lose it if they don't. And here we have rook takes a3, queen to c7, and now queen to a1. And we see now why the rook took instead of the bishop. We have the queen and bishop attacking along here, applying a huge amount of pressure to this g7 bishop, this g7 square here, and also applying a lot of pressure along this a file. And so we can see sort of how the opening has almost converted to white's advantage. Now the position is still fairly equal according to like a computer. It's plus 0.5, but but the position is open to white's advantage. White has got the open lines that they wanted, and that's what Reti was hoping for. That's what we talked about in the last video, where Reti prefers to try and open. If as white, Reti believes that you should try and open up the position as much as possible if you're the white player, because you have the advantage of having the first move, having a bit more development, and that's just what he's done. So here Rubinstein plays knight to e8, removing a lot of the pressure against g7. So after bishop takes, knight takes, we have castles. Rook takes straight away doesn't work due to bishop takes f3. If you take the queen, take, and then you can either take on h1, or you can, if you take on h1, bishop takes, or you can go to here, and then after the king moves, you take here anyway. And likewise, if after this capture, bishop takes f3, you don't take the queen, you instead take on a8, intending to try and win a rook. Well then, after rook takes a8, queen takes a8, the bishop just drops back and recaptures on a8 here. Obviously, bishop takes a8 is the move, but we've now got a queen versus a rook, assuming these two are equal. So rook takes a7 doesn't quite work due to the very nice tactic bishop takes f3. So instead we see castles. Knight to e6 is played, and now rook to b1. So rook b1 is now threatening a7, because after castling and bringing the rook across, this bishop takes f3 move has lost a lot of its sting. So we see bishop to c6, defending a7, and d4 is now played. So threatening d5. We see bishop to e4, attacking the rook, rook to d1, and now a5. So black has finally got rid of this weakness on a7. However, in doing so, they've greatly weakened this b6 pawn and the b5 square. And that's exactly what Reti's going to utilise now. He pushes d5, cutting this bishop out of the game. We have a knight to c5, a knight to d4. So white has now essentially won the c6 square. And he comments that this is one of the rare cases where Rubinstein actually is losing strategically. Usually Rubinstein might lose to a difficult to find combination. It's rare he loses strategically. But we see bishop takes g2, king takes g2, and now rook f to d8, knight to c6, and rook to d6. And then we now see rook to e3, attacking this pawn, and rook to e8. Now at this point, Reti actually comments that Morozzi felt rook takes c6 is better, actually sacrificing the exchange for black. However, Reti argues that this is almost just delaying the inevitable. But interestingly, the computer evaluates rook e8 and rook takes c6 as roughly equal. But we see rook e8 in the game. And we see queen to e5, essentially trying to provoke f6 to make this square a permanent weakness, to make it difficult to push e6 or e5. So f6, queen to b2, and now e5 is played. Except now Reti follows up with a very nice move, queen to b5. So the queen is essentially removing any potential sacrifices on c6 and continues to apply a lot of pressure onto this b6 pawn. We see king f7, but then we see the follow-up with rook b1, attacking this pawn still. And now we see knight to d7, defending this pawn, but also potentially trying to intend something like knight to b8 to trade off this knight. f3 is played, rook to c8, and rook to d3. Now, this rook d3 move is a bit of a prophylactic move in some sense. White's defending d5 because black is almost wanting to play knight to b8 to try and trade off this knight, to which white is intending to push c5. And obviously rook d3 is defending this d5 pawn and making this c5 move possible. So rook d3 is essentially preventing knight b8 due to c5 coming. And c5 is quite powerful. If b takes c5, then we'd have knight takes b8, and white would just be up a piece, quite straightforward. And if rook takes c6, then d takes c6, queen takes c6, c takes b6 can be played. We don't exchange back. So if black tries to give up the exchange, then we can just take on b6. Because after queen takes b5, rook takes b5, this pawn's coming fast, and white is just up in exchange. And if need be, they can always play rook takes a5, sacrificing this pawn, and just be up with the clear exchange. Or if after c5, black tries to defend this rook, perhaps with something like rook to d7, well then knight takes b8, rook takes b8, and d6 can come. Because after queen d8, white has quite a few different options. They can play something like c6, queen c4 check, queen c6 if they like, and these pawns are going to come very fast and very strong. So that was the whole idea of rook to d3. because after knight to b8, c5 will come, and white is now winning the game. So because of that, we see e4 being played. The only other move worth noting, actually, before we look at the actual game continuation, e4, is knight to c5, attacking the rook. But here we see queen takes b6, queen takes b6, rook takes b6, knight takes d3, e takes d3, and white is down the exchange, but these two pawns are going to come very fast and potentially going to be winning for white. Especially, rook b7 will help solidify everything. So knight c5 doesn't quite work. So instead he plays e4. But we see f takes e4, knight e5, attacking the knight and the rook. So we see Reti playing queen takes b6. And Reti's happy to give up the exchange here, because knight takes d3, e takes d3, and now white has got these three pawns that are going to be that are all passed, and they're going to queen. And he's also got a very nice pretty pawn diamond, but I don't think he was too concerned about the aesthetics. So knight takes d3 would just give white a easily winning endgame. So instead, knight takes c6 was played. Try to trade off this very powerful knight. But c5 now comes. And this is the point of playing rook d3 to allow bishop c5. This was Reti's entire aim, to try and push c5. So he doesn't take back immediately, which he could do. It's a valid option. It's nowhere near as strong. But c5 is more accurate. Rook d7, and now he takes d takes c6. We have rook takes d6, queen takes c7, rook takes c7, and now e takes d6. So everything's come off the board. Except now we see these two pawns, well, these three pawns are pass pawns. Of course, black's going to immediately take on c6. And we see that white has these two pass pawns to black's one pass pawn. And we'll see Reti really take advantage of this. Rook b7 is played, king e8 and d4, defending the pawn. Now rook a6, and now we see rook to b6, and this captures another pawn. So Reti's obviously attacking f6 and a6, and black can't take. And the variation given in the book is actually really quite pretty. C takes b6, king to d8, e5. This e5 move is very important, because after f takes e5, d takes e5, we have two pawns that are quite far away from each other. So the king is going to struggle to defend both of them. a4, e6, a3, b7, and of course, if a2, white will queen with check. So black has to play king c7. But now after b8 queen takes and e7, the game is lost. If a2, we would queen with check and just very easily win this pawn. Obviously, if the king moves, then again we could queen straight away and then very easily win this pawn. Or we'll just go down to here and win this pawn. So rook b6 was played, and this just wins the pawn because obviously if black takes, it's lost. So rook a8, and now there's no more annotations because the game is quite straightforward from here on. We see rook takes f6, and now Reti has three passed pawns in the centre. a4, rook f2, a3, rook a2, so the rook immediately guards the pawn. which also paralyzes black's rook. If black's rook ever moves, then they will lose this pawn. You see king to d7, d5, g5, and Reti starts getting his king out, king f3, rook to a4, king to e3, h5, and now Reti clarifies the position on the king side with h4, g takes h4, g takes h4, king a7, and black is just stuck. King f4, king z7, and then king f5. And here black resigned. White is simply ready to start pushing his pawns. The king's ready to join the attack, and he could even consider sacrificing this pawn. He could even go to g5 if he really wanted to. It's a very easily won game. It's going to be very difficult for Reti to lose this. And so that was game number 56. Now we've got another game where we look at a position that occurred in one of Reti's games again, where he faces Romanowski. And then that's the last of the Reti's that's the last video where we're going to be looking at Reti's actual opening. After that, we'll be looking at the games of Alexander Alekhine. Now, if you like this video, please do like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.